In March 1953, 3 weeks after Stalin died, the Soviet regime stunned the world by releasing 1.2 million prisoners, over half the Gulag's entire population, almost overnight. It looked like the era of camps and mass repression had ended. But what really replaced the Gulag, and why did so much suffering continue behind new walls? The real transformation of Soviet punishment started here. By the start of 1953, the Soviet Gulag had grown into an immense network, holding more than 2.4 million people across hundreds of camps and colonies. These prisoners were not only political opponents, but also petty criminals, ordinary citizens swept up in mass arrests, and entire groups targeted as enemies of the people. The system stretched from the forests of Karelia to the mines of Kolyma, with camps producing timber, coal, gold, and building massive projects like the White Sea to Baltic Canal and the city of Norilsk. The Ministry of Internal Affairs, called MVD, managed the camps as both prisons and factories, feeding the Soviet economy with forced labor. Yet beneath this appearance of control, the Gulag was under strain. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, costs were rising sharply. The system demanded enormous resources to guard, feed, and transport millions of inmates, many of whom were in poor health or sentenced for minor crimes. Productivity in mining and construction lagged behind expectations, and failures mounted on projects like the Volga-Don Canal. Internal reports warned that short-term prisoners contributed little to output but drove up supervision and supply costs. In 1951, Deputy Minister S.S. Mamulov proposed shifting as many as 70% of inmates to exile labor outside the camps, arguing that the Gulag had become bloated and inefficient. These recommendations were shelved at the time, but they reveal growing anxiety among officials about the system's viability. Discontent was not limited to the bureaucracy. Prisoner uprisings at Kolyma, Steplag, and Ozalag became more frequent, sometimes involving thousands of inmates refusing work or demanding better conditions. These incidents exposed the limits of repression and the risk of mass unrest. Local authorities and central planners alike began to question whether the Gulag could continue to function at such a scale, especially as the Soviet Union faced new economic and political pressures after the war. By the eve of Stalin's death, the Gulag was no longer just a tool of terror. It was a sprawling, costly, and increasingly unstable institution. The economic and administrative burdens weighed heavily on the MVD, and internal debates about downsizing had already begun. This set the stage for rapid, sweeping changes once the leadership vacuum opened in March of 1953. On March 27, 1953, less than a month after Stalin's death, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet issued a decree that would send shockwaves through the Soviet Union. The order, drafted and championed by Lavrentiy Beria, called for the immediate release of over 1 million prisoners from the camps and colonies. The amnesty was sweeping in scale, but sharply defined by its criteria. Only those sentenced to 5 years or less for non-violent, non-political crimes qualified for unconditional release. Special categories, juveniles, pregnant women, mothers with young children, the elderly, and the gravely ill were included as well. But the decree drew a hard line. Most political prisoners, especially those convicted under Article 58 for counter-revolutionary activity, and anyone serving long sentences for violent or state crimes, remained behind barbed wire. The leadership behind the decree, Beria, Malenkov, and Khrushchev, had each played a role in building the machinery of repression. Now, facing a nation exhausted by war and terror, they turned to amnesty as a calculated act. The official language of the decree spoke of strengthening the Soviet state and humanist principles, but internal records and later memoirs point to urgent political motives. With Stalin gone, the new rulers needed to shore up their legitimacy, calm a restless society, and relieve the state of the Gulag's enormous costs. Implementation began at a staggering pace. Within weeks, trains packed with former inmates rumbled out of remote regions. Kolyma, Vorkuta, Karaganda headed for cities and villages across the Soviet Union. Local authorities scrambled to process the influx. Many returnees arrived with little more than a release slip and a ration card, overwhelming housing offices and employment bureaus. Party reports from the spring and summer of 1953 describe crowded stations, rising anxiety in provincial towns, and a spike in petty crime blamed on the sudden wave of amnesty defenders. In some areas, police and local officials voiced open concern about social order, fueling debate in in Moscow over the wisdom of such a broad release. Yet for those left behind, especially political prisoners serving long sentences, the amnesty offered little hope. Word of the decree spread quickly through the camps, sometimes sparking unrest and protests among inmates excluded from release. Letters and appeals began to pour in, demanding a review of sentences and a broader definition of justice. The leadership's first move had loosened the grip of the Gulag, but it had also exposed the unfinished business of Stalin's legacy. The question of who truly deserved freedom would soon force the Soviet state to confront the deeper injustices still locked inside its prison walls. Between 1954 and 1956, the Soviet state launched a systematic review of Gulag sentences, carried out by commissions under the Procuracy and the Central Committee. Prosecutors and legal officials pored over the files of those convicted of counter-revolutionary crimes, cases often decided by secret police panels or wartime tribunals. Priority went to party members purged in the 1930s and the 1940s, victims of obviously fabricated charges, and those tied to now disgraced security officials. Many cases were annulled or reclassified, leading to early release or a downgrading from political to criminal status. Yet the process was uneven. Nationalists, religious activists, and wartime collaborators often remained under suspicion, and full legal rehabilitation lagged far behind the pace of releases. The scale of change was immense. From March 1953 to October 1958, more than 4 million people left camps and colonies, some through amnesty, others through these commission reviews. By 1956, the Gulag population had dropped to about 1.6 million. Within a few years, the number of prisoners fell to less than a quarter of what it had been at Stalin's death. At the same time, the entire penal system was being rebranded. Under Khrushchev's push for socialist legality, the language of punishment changed. The term Gulag faded from official use, replaced by corrective labor colonies and colony settlements. Control over these facilities shifted from a single centralized administration to regional and republic-level ministries. Massive industrial combines and construction trusts once run by the camps were shut down or handed over to regular ministries. The era of the Gulag as an economic empire was over. What remained was a much smaller, more bureaucratic network, still harsh, but now framed as a system of correction and rehabilitation rather than terror and exploitation. On January 25, 1960, the Ministry of Internal Affairs issued Order No. 20. The document dissolved the main administration of corrective labor camps and colonies, erasing the Gulag from the Soviet bureaucratic map. Official reports described this as the end of an era, a final break with mass terror. Yet the reality was far less straightforward. The order simply transferred remaining camps and colonies to regional ministries, shrinking the system but not uprooting its foundations. Forced labor and political imprisonment continued, just under new names and with fresh paperwork. Perm 36, a camp near the city of Perm, became a symbol of this hidden continuity. Even after the central Gulag administration vanished, Perma 36 held political prisoners, Ukrainian nationalists, religious activists, and human rights campaigners well into the 1980s. Inmates described familiar routines: labor under guard, punishment cells, informers, and hunger strikes. The camp records show that the last political prisoners left only in 1987, decades after the supposed abolition. For those the state now labeled as mentally unfit, a different network awaited. By the 1970s, tens of thousands were confined in special psychiatric hospitals, diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia or other invented disorders. These institutions, run by the Ministry of Health and MVD, operated as high-security prisons. Dissent was treated as illness, and forced medication replaced the labor brigade. Administrative reform had stripped away the Gulag's name and centralized power, but the machinery of repression adapted. Behind the new facades, the Soviet Union preserved the tools of control, forced labor, intimidation, and the silencing of dissent long after the world believed the Gulag was gone. Today, Russia holds one of the world's largest prison populations, and political repression takes new forms. The legacy of the Gulag endures, not as memory, but as practice. Systems may change names, but their shadows linger. Justice is never permanent. It demands vigilance, not just history. Share your thoughts below.